This is Leewood Online, a ministry of Leewood Baptist Church, located in the Kansas City area. For more information about us, visit us online at www.leewoodbaptist.com.
Before I came up, because be prepared this morning for all of us together as a faith family to get our toes stepped on a little bit. When we were looking at starting a sermon series through the book of James, I was a little bit hesitant because I know what James is like. I remember as a youth pastor, I took our teens through the book of James, and I just remember going through that and just even that idea of feeling like I don't know if I'm the right person to be sharing this information from God's Word, because you walk through it, and James has a way of pulling no punches, and today is another one of those days as we walk through this. I mean, when we look at James and what we've seen so far, remember, James obviously is the writer of this book, and he's writing to the persecuted church of Jerusalem. They've been spread out throughout the region because of persecution. Many of these people had family members who had been tortured and killed because of their faith in Jesus Christ. And so so James is writing that, and so he opens right off the bat, holding no punches, and he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you fall into trials of various kinds." And he goes on to unpack how the believer is supposed to have this eternal perspective. Well, if we're all honest, many times, if not most of the time in our lives, we do not have an eternal perspective on our lives. We kind of live day to day, hour by hour, minute to minute, and we kind of just live in the here and now, and we forget that we're living for a much bigger purpose. And so that when God does bring trials, difficulties, and sufferings in our lives, that we forget what God might be at work trying to do in our lives and producing character and virtue in our lives, different testing and suffering. But then he says here in verse 5, he says, "Now if any of you lack wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him." As I've been studying this book and preparing sermons and even been reading it on my own in the past, whenever I come to, like, let's go back to what we looked at last week. Whenever I come to James chapter 3, the first 12 verses of James chapter 3, you look at the tongue and how difficult it is to tame our tongues, and we need God to change us. We need the Lord to give us wisdom. We keep coming back to James chapter 1 and verse 5, because if we're going to hear the Word of God and do the Word of God, we need wisdom. We go back and we think about living a life of concern for those that are marginalized in society. We need wisdom to do that. If we are going to avoid the sin of favoritism and partiality in our spiritual walks, we're going to need what? Wisdom to do that. If we are going to live in a way where our works prove our faith, and we live out our faith through our works, that's going to take wisdom. And so wisdom is really, really important. So if someone was going to ask you how to define wisdom, how would you define it? All right, ask yourself the question. You don't have to tell anyone, hopefully not near you, unless it's your family, but you don't have to spit it out. But like, for just a second, if someone were to come to you and say, "What does it mean to have wisdom?" what would you say? I think sometimes we think of wisdom as being like really, really smart, right? Like, man, I feel I have a high IQ and I'm really intelligent, and then therefore I have wisdom. But when we look at our world around us, we have really smart people who don't have wisdom. So that can't be that. Or sometimes I think if we think of wisdom, we think that wisdom comes from age, right? Well, as the older I get, the more mature I'll get, so therefore I'll have more wisdom. And there is such a thing as wisdom that comes from life experience or the school of hard knocks, but that's not the wisdom that James is talking about. When we talk about spiritual wisdom in Proverbs, Solomon writes in the Old Testament in Proverbs, he writes a lot about wisdom. He writes to his son, and he says, "Pursue wisdom like you would a great treasure." So when we talk about wisdom, what are we talking about? Here's how I would define it. Now, if you want to define it a little bit differently, that's okay. I'm open for debate on this, okay? But here's how I would define wisdom, spiritual wisdom. The ability to live life well. All right, if we want to get even more spiritual, to live a life that is pleasing to God. That's wisdom. So a wise Christ follower is someone that can live a life of pleasing God. That's going to take wisdom. But here in verses 13 and 18 that we're going to see here in a minute, there are two kinds of wisdom. We're going to see that there is worldly wisdom and there's also godly wisdom, and we're going to see the differences. And James does a really good job of helping us differentiate, okay, what is worldly wisdom and what is godly wisdom? There is such a thing as worldly wisdom. We'll talk about that here in a minute. And there's also such a thing as godly wisdom. What James is doing in this entire book is to define and show and help us realize what godly wisdom looks like. So look at verse 13. Let's read that, verses 13 through 16. It says this. Who among you is wise and understanding? By his good conduct, he should show that his works are done in the gentleness that comes from wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't boast and deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there is disorder in every evil practice. So James starts out in this section to define, well, we're going to kind of continue on that theme of faith without works is dead, but now James is going to talk about something very, very specifically. And so let's walk through this passage together and just promise me you don't get mad at me, okay? Let's look at James chapter 3 and let's look at verse 1. It says this. We're going to just stop at verse 1 for just a moment. It says, not many should become teachers, my brothers, because you know that we will receive a stricter judgment. What in the world is James?
This program interests me because the course content and the opportunity for professional development really stood out to me. I looked at a few different education programs in the area, and I believe that this is the best one for helping me become an elementary school teacher. As far as my experience with children, I think I first realized I was interested in helping children